Hi, my name's Ian, welcome to my channel, and this is going to be a ramble about King Arthur. Reason why I'm doing this now is ahead of a review that I'm putting together on the role-playing game Pendragon, which deals with King Arthur and a number of particular things, but it deals with an interpretation of Arthur, and it's a good game. But we'll come to that when we go to it. What I wanted to do ahead of that is to lay down some of background on King Arthur and what it means to me as a Brit, which you may have picked up on as from my accent. But Arthur himself is a very British thing, or initially a very British thing. It obviously deals with what has been coined in the past as the matter of Britain, and is very much part of the fabric of British legendarium, British mythology. Now, I'm not suggesting for in any kind of way that no one should be able to do anything with King Arthur other than British people. That's not what the purpose of this is about. This is about because so many of the things that we get cycling around King Arthur are, shall we say, a non-British viewpoint of the King Arthur materials. I just thought it might be interesting for me as a amateur historian that has kind of grown up within the shadow of Arthur as part of the fabric of my upbringing, what my thoughts on it all are and what my understanding is. Now, there are lots of different things. There's a difference between what I will call received history and actual history, and received history is that which you kind of know because you're brought up being told this, and received history is not always correct because some of it is based on understandings that have long since been out of date, and not everyone is a historical scholar or an archaeologist or anything like that. So as our understanding of history is built upon, not all of these received historical facts go away. Classic example of that is the difference between Boudica and Boadicea. So when I was a kid growing up, we were always told that there was this queen of the Iceni who was called Boadicea. But now our understanding of her name and the way that it should have been translated and stuff, we now know her as Boudica. So, but there are still lots of people out there that still call her Boadicea, and that is the sort of accepted form of her name, received history. So what I'm not going to do now is to reiterate and go into depths of the archaeology of Arthur and all of the things that the history and whether Arthur was real. Well, I am going to touch on whether Arthur was real a little bit and a little bit of the history, but it's mainly the stuff received and my own delvings into Arthur to try and understand what it comes from, and just probably a random. It's a ramble. It's a ramble, so don't expect anything completely codified. Now, what I've got here is a pile of various books that I have received my own Arthurian journey from. In a literary form, and I'll intermix that with bits that I have received just purely from the fact of being brought up in England and from visiting a lot of the places that the real places, or the places that we know are real because they still exist today, that cycle around in the Arthurian canon or mythology or whatever. Now, the Arthurian canon is an interesting one as well, because what does that actually mean? And then our journey will find out that that's not quite as a simple question as it might seem. Okay, so Arthur himself. Let me start by by saying, other than growing up as a kid in England, you are introduced to characters such as Robin Hood and King Arthur, and that's sort of, you know, the foundation of what you are and when you're playing out in the streets. Whereas Americans might grow up playing cowboys and Indians, or at least before that was not politically correct to do that, but however that works. We were brought up by playing, you know, running out in the woods and playing Robin Hood, or playing King Arthur, or playing Doctor Who, or whatever. Yeah, but Doctor Who's another sort of foundation of growing up for people of a certain age in England, Britain, or whatever. Right, so from that you start watching movies, or maybe you know, when the subject is familiar to you and you see a book that's about it, or you see a movie that's about it, you're more inclined to go and see that book, or read that book, sorry, or go and watch that movie or whatever, because it's based on something that you know about, right? So you're a fan of Lord of the Rings, and then someone makes a Lord of the Rings movie, so you go out and watch it, or however those things. So growing up, you know, as a kid, you're wandering around, stabbing each other with fake swords and everything, and else that, saying that I'm King Arthur and everything else, and then you start to realise that there are books and there are movies and so on about King Arthur. So my introduction onto that side of it was this book here, not this particular title of book, no, this actual book that I had when I was a kid. Anyway, so Stories of King Arthur. It's illustrated. The illustrations are, you know, of their time, and it's great. It's an accessible book. It is definitely written for children. What it essentially does is it takes Le Morte d'Arthur and that sort of, which we'll come on to, that sort of more collected version of the Arthurian myths, and sanitizes them. So a lot of the bits and pieces, like the incest side of things, and the Lancelot's infidelity and that kind of thing, or Lancelot and Guinevere's infidelity, it takes two to tango, right? All of that is kind of sanitized out of this. So if you ever want to go and give your kids something that's not a silly, ridiculously thin Ladybird kids book about King Arthur, there's a little bit a step up from that, definitely. Makes it very readable, but also doesn't expose them to some of the more adult portions of Arthur's tale. Then I can absolutely thoroughly recommend this. The Stories of King Arthur by Blanche Winder. It's very good, and the testament of it, if you want a review, a testament, whatever, of that, is the fact that I read this when I was very small, and it didn't put me off Arthur, and in fact made my interest in Arthur grow. So that's sort of where we're going up to. It was originally published in 1968. So we'll go back and lead up to that. So we'll start with, who was Arthur? There's a big question, but I think it's easily answered. A lot of people delve into trying to work out who the historical Arthur was, and I wrote an article for Dragon magazine a while back that did try to at least put some framework around who Arthur might have been, in presenting that sort of a more historically correct version of Dark Ages Britain. It's not really correct. There are certain alterations that are made to make it into a game setting sort of thing, but it was basically a campaign setting set in Dark Ages Britain that made some sort of nods towards Dungeons and Dragons, the rule set, and made some assumptions as to the historicity of certain things. So I think it was Dragon issue 257, something like that. If you want to look it up, I'll splat things on the screen as I go. yes. So who was Arthur? That's where we're getting to. Who was Arthur? Now, my own personal belief of who Arthur was, or who the Arthur that we have received in a historical context. We'll get into all the anachronisms of the from the 12th century on depictions of Arthur in a bit. But for now, the historicity of Arthur. I think he was, like Robin Hood, an amalgamation of a number of people that were around at the time, and a number of events, and in order to try and make sense of all of these things or whatever, you've got to remember that the way history was recorded back then was very biased towards what an individual wanted to put forward, what perspective or whatever they wanted to put forward in their work, and a lot of it was written down by monks, and so there is a lot of religious forwarding of things, and we'll see that as we delve into some of the older works that are either hover around the basis and the foundation of where Arthur comes from. So I don't believe that there was an individual King Arthur that did all of the things that certain works prior to the romances, that certain works ascribe him as doing. You've got feats that are said, this is King Arthur did this. And you can kind of tell that by some of the chronologies where they're saying, because some of them are like ridiculous. It's King Arthur did this, beat these people up here, and then 100 years later he did the same thing, or beat someone up over here as well, and it's ridiculous. Britain didn't work that way at that time, and no one lived that long. So so I think it's like a superhero, and a lot of the mould of Arthur has changed over time. I'll get onto that in a second. Well, as we go through this, I'll give you an analogy to try and work it through that you might, from a contemporary mind, might get you figured out into how this sort of stuff evolves. So if you are familiar at all with superheroes, right? Who isn't these days because of big Marvel movies and everything else? So you go back, imagine Captain America, right? So Captain America back in the day, 1940s character, go out taking part in World War II, very much a sort of part propaganda to gee up the troops that were fighting in World War II, superhero that goes around and beats Nazis up, all of that kind of stuff. Really great. Then Captain America is reintroduced in the 1960s. Obviously, you should know this from the movie as well. Frozen under the ice and is retrieved and then becomes a prominent member of the Avengers in the comics. So the character is reimagined and put into context in that 1960s, even though it's the same character drawn from the 1940s into the 1960s thing. So same Captain America, just different emphasis on it. And then a similar kind of thing. So these characters, evolved through the 1970s, according to the needs and entertainment modes of the time of the 1970s. Changed again in 1980s. You got that more sort of grittier age of comic book stories. Again in the 1990s, very much a superhero type thing. You had a awful movie pushed out, Captain America movie pushed out in the 1990s, and you got the cartoons coming in as well, which another version of Captain America. You got, as you go into the 2000s, and obviously the movies and all of this kind of stuff, right? So our view of Captain America has evolved over time as society has changed, and the character has been changed to slot into that society. Same thing has happened to King Arthur. So if you look back at the earliest sources that even half mention him, and we'll get on to Ambrosius Aurelianus in a second, even half mention him, or potentially lay the foundations for what they'd later become Arthur, you see that in this particular work from this particular time, he or some version of maybe is described as this particular thing, and then in a later time, go forward 100 years, he's described as something completely different, and so on. So Arthur may have been an historical figure, but his the feats that are now put on him are not historical. And in many cases, I believe what we're talking about is a single figure, a superhero, a British mythological superhero, on which a number of feats that have gone through history, some of which are made up, some of which may have been real, that have been given to this character, creating an amalgamation, a superheroic amalgamation of a being that has then been altered as time has gone and different people have written about him to serve whatever those particular people have needed from a superheroic warrior, king / knight or whatever at that particular time. So from that perspective, I think going and hunting down a historical Arthur, I think, is a bit of a pointless exercise. And where some of the research that people have done in order to try and delve into things to figure out who a real Arthur was, they're interesting, and they're interesting to follow through, and they're interesting to read, but they're ultimately fruitless, and it doesn't take too much research to unravel the direction they're going in. Again, I'll come on to a couple of those that I think are most interesting to read, and later when we get on to some of the things. But that's the basic foundation of it. Arthur, as a historical figure, is a fruitless holy grail to go and chase after. Rather, we should be looking at him in terms of a superhero from the Dark Ages, which is a horribly misnamed period of history, and that has been altered over the centuries to fit society, to continue being that superheroic mythological figure. Right, so where do we get to? Let's go from really early work. Gildas. So this is the Excidio Britanniae. That's it is the on the ruin of Britain, or the ruin and invasions of Britain. Now I'm going to let's get some context going before I write onto this. You basically had in the British Isles, wherever they came from, some of the historical works or pseudo-historical works actually try and deal with where the British people came from, but we'll cover those as we go to the books. But basically, you had a bunch of people that lived in Britain that then were either taken over or influenced by or came into the sphere of the Celtic cultures of Europe, at which point Britain was a patchwork of Celtic tribes. Then after which the Romans invaded and took over Britain and held on to Britain for around 3.5 centuries. And then after that, the Romans, because the Roman Empire was falling apart and they needed the Roman military elsewhere to stave off people like Attila, the Romans, well, to say the Romans left, that's a bit wrong. What happened is that the Roman military withdrew to go and do things elsewhere within the collapsing Roman Empire, leaving the Romano-British or Romanized British people to go and fend for themselves. They were subject to attacks, and they either invited over or they had people turn up on the doorstep that they then entered an alliance with, or however it worked. You had the Germanic tribes turn up, the Angles, Jutes and Saxons. Ultimately, the Angles, Jutes and Saxons fought against the Britons, and then ultimately you ended up with the formation of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that then joined to form Angleland, or England. So that's like potted history. So that gives us a framework as where everything sort of fits into all of this, that I can hang some of these things in. So Gildas. Gildas is a Briton monk. Christianity. Let's work at that as well, because a lot of these will deal with Christianity. So Britain wasn't Christian under the Celts. Obviously, Romans came in. Christianity eventually became the religion of the Roman Empire. So the British Isles became Christian because of that. There were two competing forms of Christianity at the time. There was the Celtic Christian and the Roman Christian. The Synod of Whitby happened. That sort of determined which form of Christianity was going to be adopted. I'm probably, oh no, hang on, I'm jumping ahead here, but whatever. So the Romans came, eventually Christianized the British people. The Anglo-Saxons, they weren't Christian originally, so the battles or whatever between the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons in post-Roman British Isles were partly a religious conflict, and then ultimately the Anglo-Saxons became Christianized by Augustine at a later point, and there were a mishmash of Christian Saxon kingdoms and pagan Saxon kingdoms that also fought against each other. The Battle of Heavenfield, Battle of Heathfield, Wessex versus Mercia, all of that kind of thing. So there we go, that's the framework. So Gildas, let's go back to Gildas. The reason why I wanted all of that stuff and the religious side of stuff is you could understand Gildas. Gildas was a monk. This book came out around about in 530 AD. This was not long, maybe a century after the withdrawal of Rome. So a lot of it is during that period where the Britons are being shoved back and the Anglo-Saxons are taking over. So what Gildas is doing is he's basically saying all of this stuff about Vortigern. He does mention Vortigern. I believe he mentions Vortigern. Inviting. Oh yeah, he does mention Vortigern. Vortigern as Guthrigern, inviting the Saxons to come and help them fight against the people that are invading because the Romans were no longer there to protect them, was a mistake. So on the ruin of Britain, this is kind of like, it's the biggest mistake that we ever made was the Britons ever made was inviting these Saxons in to do the things, because then it all went to pot. And one of the things that Britain has kings, but they are tyrants. It's a good statement, isn't it? Right. So one of the things that Gildas mentions is the Battle of Badon, or the Battle of Mons Badonicus, and that becomes important because that is one of the battles that is ascribed in several sources as being a battle fought by Arthur. Gildas has it by being led by a war leader called Ambrosius Aurelianus, who was probably a Romano-Briton or a Roman military leader who remained in Britain, or descendant thereof, or some such. That's that's the important thing there for me, is that we have an earlier mention of a battle that becomes part of the King Arthur mythological cycle, ascribed to another figure. And this is why, if you read my Dragon article about this, I basically say Ambrosius Aurelianus is the most likely figure for the original starting point for the Arthur myth. So this is why, because there's that immediate correlation. In Gildas, which is one of the earliest sources that we've got that says anything about anything like this, we've got this guy, Ambrosius Aurelianus, did this at Mons Badonicus, and then later on you've got Arthur did this at Mount Badon. So that's where this sort of correlation goes. Anyway, so Gildas leads on to Nennius. There we go, Nennius. This is really short. If you ever want to sort of pick this thing up. So the Historia Britonum, and this is the history of Britain, where, I mean, again, he goes on to be very religious about things, but this is where the mythological side of things starts to pick up. When I say mythological side of things, what I mean by that, this is where we start getting the connection between Britain and Troy. Now, if you've never heard of this connection, then hear me out. There is a penchant. If you are given the luxury of history writing, especially if you're in a regime where people are likely to believe what you put down in words on paper, then you have the luxury of doing all sorts of things, especially of linking yourself or your particular organisation or whatever into things that are of import and recognition. So, for example, you've got in Italy, you have the legend of the founding of Rome by Romulus and Remus, and Romulus and Remus, you know, raised by a she-wolf and everything else, but they came from Troy, so they've got that lineage that goes back to the ancient Greeks, or that ancient sort of period that the Romans very much were enamoured by. And you know, there's all sorts of other bits and pieces, like the bringing of the Holy Grail, you know, the cup that Jesus drank out of, to Britain, which then links or gives Britain some kind of link to the whole Christian mythology, rather than it just being this religion that grew up in this particular place that this country has adopted. Instead of just that, you know, it came from there and now we follow it. It actually it came from there and we are part of it. So you see that there's a difference there. So if you've got that sort of luxury of being able to write stuff like that, and it happens over and over and over again, you can see that, especially in religion and mythology, you can see that we have this particular thing, so therefore we want to try and be part of it, instead of it just being something that we've adopted from somewhere. We want to actually be part of the weaving of the myth, and it's, you know, if you want to consider things like golden plates and all this kind of thing. Anyway, so this is one of the things that Nennius was trying to do. So Nennius had this idea that there was a guy called Brutus who was a descendant of Aeneas, of the Aeneid fame. So the Odyssey and all of that. Well, that was written by Homer, but you know, all of the stories that go about the fall of Troy and what happened next, and the founding of Rome and so on. So what he's doing is tying in the early history of Britain with all of that sort of ancient stuff and Roman stuff and ancient Greek stuff. So now Britain just isn't an isolated island just off the coast of Europe. It's actually part of this grand sweeping epic that involves the battles against Troy and the founding of Rome and all of this kind of stuff. It's all part and parcel of all of that kind of thing. So Nennius has this descendant, of Aeneas, Brutus, who comes to Britain with his people and settles Britain, and in fact Britain becomes named after him. So you know, Britain comes from Brutus, apparently. So some of the very foundations of Britain itself come from here, but also of Arthur. So Arthur's in here, mentioned as not as a king, but as a war leader, where he's doing stuff. I'm just trying to think, try and find what it says. You got Vortigern. I'll go into like Vortigern and Vortimer and things like that. But and we have Ambrosius. But there is a bit. There we go. it was that so at this point, Vortigern's still going. He's still the king, unless he's been poisoned by that point. But you've got the magnanimous Arthur, with all of the kings and military forces of Britain, fought against the Saxons, and there were many more noble than himself, yet he was 12 times chosen their commander, and was often a conqueror. The first battle which he engaged with was at the mouth of the river Glenai. The second, third, fourth, and fifth were on another river that the Britons called Douglas, in the region of Linus, Linus. The sixth on the river Bassas, the seventh at the wood of Caledon, which the Britons call Catcoit Caledon, and the eighth was near Gurnion Castle, where Arthur bore the image of the Holy Virgin, the Mother of God, upon his shoulders. That comes later as well, where you've got, especially in Monmouth. And through the power of our Lord Jesus Christ and the Holy Mary, put the Saxons to flight and pursued them for the whole day with a great slaughter. The ninth was the city of Legion, which is called Caerleon. The 10th was at the banks of the river Truroy. The 11th was the mountain of Breguon, which is called Cat Bregion. And the 12th was the most severe contest when Arthur penetrated the hill of Baden. Arthur at Baden. So we've gone from Gildas and Brosius Aurelianus at Mons Badonicus to Arthur at Baden. And in this engagement 940 fell by his hand alone, but no one but the Lord affording him assistance. In all of these engagements the Britons were successful, for the strength can avail against the will of the Almighty. So there you go. So then we got Arthur specifically, first mention of a figure called Arthur doing stuff, right? So that was about 828. So we're talking about roughly 400 years, 350 to 400 years after the course of things that it's writing about. And somewhere in the midst of that, and less useful to our story, but I thought I'd mention it anyway, is Bede, the wonderful Bede. Now Bede mentions Mount Baden. Let's have a look. See, Bede whitters on a lot about this was the emperor at this particular time, and this was the pope at this particular time, and this is what religion was being followed and what version of Christianity and so on. But that was if you got a book and you were writing a book called the Ecclesiastical History of England, and you kind of expect it to be going on about the history of Britain from a religious perspective. So I mean this it describes the fact that the Romans go away and the Britons go, help, we are now being invaded by a bunch of stuff. And Romans going, well, we can't really do that. We can't help like that. That's 423. So you've got what's called the groans of the Britons, and bad things happening, and the Picts fighting, the Irish fighting, beating up the Britons, and then you have got. I'm trying to find it. So you've got Vortigern again. Vortigern saying to Hengist and Horsa, please come and help us. So there you go, you've got the Saxon Angles and Jutes that come up over to help, but then they do bad things. So you've got this entry for 493 AD, when the victorious invaders, that is the Angles and Saxons and so on, have scattered and destroyed the native peoples, the Britons, and returned to their own dwellings. The Britons slowly began to take heart and recover their strength, emerging from their dens that they had hidden themselves and joining in prayer that God might help them to avoid complete extermination. Their leader at this time was, drumroll, Ambrosius Aurelianus, a man of good character and the sole survivor of Roman race from the catastrophe. Among the slain had been his own parents, who were of royal birth and title. Under his leadership, the Britons took up arms, challenged their conquerors to battle, and with God's help inflicted a defeat upon them. Thenceforth, victory swung first to one side and then to the other until the Battle of Baden Hill. when the Britons made a considerable slaughter of the invaders, and this took place about 44 years after their arrival in Britain. So there you go. So what we have so far, to recap, we have Gildas, earliest one, around about 530, no mention of Arthur. However, it does mention Ambrosius Aurelianus at Mons Bidonicus. Next, well, actually, let's do B first. So Bede, about 731 AD. We've got Mount Baden, and we also have Ambrosius Aurelianus leading the Britons to victory against the Saxons at Mount Baden, right? After which, Mount Baden is important because after which there was a lull in the fight between the Britons and the Saxons. And during the peace between that period, you've effectively got this supposed division of Britain between the Saxons and the Britons, during which time, allegedly, so some of the later books go, you had Arthur being king. Right, so and then we've got Nennius writing in 828 AD, where he is saying we've got Arthur at Mount Baden. So if you took those alone, you took those books alone, you would say that, well, maybe Arthur's just another name for Ambrosius Aurelianus. Right, but what I believe is that Nennius is now writing. Nennius is about a century after Bede. Right? I think what Nennius is doing is forming the basis for this superheroic Arthur figure, who is only semi-historical. And that list of, so in Nennius you get that list of battles that Arthur is meant to have led the Britons on. That's where we get that disparity. So Gildas specifically mentions Ambrosius Aurelianus at Mount Baden. Bede specifically mentions Ambrosius Aurelianus at Mount Baden. Nennius gives a whole list of battles and ascribes them to Arthur leading the Britons against the Saxons at those things, ending with Mount Baden, and that's where eventually they shut the Saxons down for a period of time. And the span of those battles, the historicity, or the historical span of those battles, is more than one lifetime. So this is where I think Nennius is where Arthur leaves the historical path, or our Arthur figure leaves the historical path, starts becoming more of a legendary superheroic figure.